Good evening. Well, I guess it's still afternoon where I am, but it's evening where John is. Um, Either way, a good day to everyone. I hope everyone went to church today. It's the first Sunday in over 2 years in my diocese where the Sunday obligation is back on. So, yeah, of course, I've been going for a long time, because I essentially ignored all the COVID restrictions because they are fake. Um, oh hey Elijah. So anyway, like me, I like historical issues. I like scriptural issues.
hmm
When it comes to philosophy, not my forte. So that's why I'm bringing in top apologist John Fisher 2.0, who runs the YouTube channel Original Win Productions. And so he is going to give us an intro to um, moral philosophy. And yeah, um, John, before I let you take it away, just a couple questions. How long have you been studying this topic?
Well, I started the most serious I got into it was back when I was in university. I took a year of philosophy, and one of the courses I took was on ethics, and they gave me a pretty huge anthology, and they ran through all these different ethical perspectives. So something you realize that when you go to an ethics class, it's basically comparative ethical studies. It's like comparative world religions. It's like they lay out all these different positions, they compare and contrast them, and then they're like, yeah, you guys kind of decide like which one makes like the most sense to you as reasonable beings, and then you just kind of go from there. Philosophy is a bit different. Like if you do something like engineering, there's no differences about which equations are the best to calculate which how if the bridge is going to hold up weight. A lot of those things are just pretty much uniform. Whereas philosophy, if you want to look at it, it's kind of like the way I see it anyway. It's kind of like the conceptual analysis discipline, where basically the whole job of philosophers is to come up with these various concepts, definitions, ideas, and understandings, and they basically later become applied, if they're any good, to other more well formulated disciplines, and some of them even become disciplines of their own. So, psychology is actually something very recently that was heavily related to philosophy, but then it kind of became its own discipline. So think of it kind of like R&D. And ethics is kind of a very similar discipline, because if you look at ethics, its basic ideas are taken up by other fields like law or business or various institutions, and then it's put into practice there. And even
Mm.
in theology, we have moral theology, where we kind of understand ethics through a frame of assessing our own scriptural data, our own religious tradition, and we talk about its relationship to God and the church. So from there, it's moral philosophy is kind of like a supporting role, and I've been interested in it since that time I was in university, and still today. Even my own viewpoints are still being better refined, and I think I've come to a better understanding of what the general moral philosophical issues are. I've At one point I held one belief, at another point I've held another, but it's still something I'm generally interested in and trying to best formulate in relation to my own religious beliefs,
So I did. Oh, sorry.
and also in terms of my own apologetic and my own way of understanding the Catholic faith.
Okay, so you talked about certain camps where you in. Like, what is a camp you're in now?
Sure. So I'm what's called a moral naturalist. A moral
Hmm.
naturalist is someone who believes that moral properties like good and evil, what you like what you ought to do and what you ought not to do, what you are permitted to do and what you're not permitted to do, these sorts of languages ultimately reduce down to natural properties. So, and by natural I mean they're concrete. They're things that um, that can that we have causal interaction with. So, so for example, take scientific facts like my cell phone is black. Ultimately, we can reduce that down to talk about uh, length. Talk about light waves just bouncing off there, hitting your retinas, going into your brain, that sort of thing.
It's
Whereas,
a black phone. Yeah.
yeah, yeah. I mean, yeah, you could break this down to much into other physical descriptions, but ultimately, we're interacting with black, the color. Um, Whereas other camps don't hold to this view. So there are two other camps, and this is what's called metaethics. Metaethics just is about the moral language that we use and trying to give definitions, ideas, descriptions. Um, the second camp is called moral non-naturalism. So take the equation 2 plus 2 equals 4. Alan, have you ever interacted with the number 2?
Yes. I think it comes after one. Last I checked. Is that the
Last you
one?
check? Yeah, that's the one. Like have you ever
Oh,
walked down the street and run into the number 2? Do you know how long? Do you know how tall it is? How it smells? Things like that.
well, not all twos are created equal. You know. Yeah.
Exactly.
No,
So,
I don't know how.
yeah, like we'll talk about two sets of things, like your two cups, or um, or you go onto your desk and you could pull out two books. So you could talk about two things, like two concrete things, but the number 2 in and of itself isn't concrete. It's not something you interact with. It's an abstract property. So some people think good and evil are abstract, like the number 2. They're real, they exist, but they're not something you causally interact with. And the final camp, these are called the moral not. These are called the moral anti-realists. They think that moral language and moral properties are either going to fall into one of these three things. They're going to be either subjective, so that, and by subjective they mean stance dependent. So, for example, if I was to say um, strangling children is wrong, I'm
Hmm.
just I'm not really saying something that's true independent of my own personal stance or the personal stance of society or even the universal stance of every subjective being. So it's going to be either subjective or it's going to be false. So those properties aren't going to exist, or they're going to be trivial. Like, here's an example. If I was to say cooperation, human cooperation is what we mean when we say, or something leads to human cooperation is what we mean by something is good. Like, friendship is good because it leads to human cooperation. Well, that seems trivial. Like, why should I say that's good and not cooperation between human beings and other animals? Or what if the Blorgons invaded Earth? And why should we say human cooperation is good and not cooperation with the Blorgons who enslave us? And cooperation there is actually going to be beneficial to us. So these seem trivial, or they seem to be like redefinitions. So moral anti-realists are going to take that position. So these are like the three broad views of morality. And even within these camps, there are differences about which ones exactly are are going to be the way we break things down. So, for instance, there are people who are divine command theorists. They say that the good is whatever God commands, or something like that.
God is
If
good all the time.
all the time He is good, yeah.
Amen.
So,
Hey, just pause for a second. Have you read this book?
uh, no, but I know the general argument, and I've known very few philosophers who really like that book. I've seen how Sam Harris tries to defend it, and it's bad. So the moral landscape is, as Sam understands it, he thinks that there are various sorts of hills where we speak about things being better or worse than one another. So, for example, if I was to put my hand on a stove, that's really bad. Like you,
Hmm.
and pretty much no one's going to say that that's a good thing. So he's going to say, well, because of a universal agreement, we're going to say that's bad, and that's like at the very low peak. And other things are great. Imagine a world with no suffering and everybody can flourish by pursuit of knowledge and meditation, like the peak most
Sounds
wonderful
like
world.
what Steven Pinker's trying to promote now.
Interesting. I
It's a
can't really.
joke, but I'll just say that.
But so basically, Sam makes these appeals to universal preferences. But what is a universal preference other than something that stance dependent? It's universal, but it still stands dependent. So
Yeah.
he's not really arguing for anything that's morally realistic. He's just saying that human beings seem to have preferences, but he doesn't go into any depth in proving it. So for what it's worth, though, I'm actually Sam, like myself, is a moral naturalist, but I just don't think he's convincing. And
So, in terms of Sam Harris, he basically says, and like this book I've had, it's sitting on my shelf forever. I haven't actually read it myself. Perhaps I
mhm.
should. Uh, so he just says the stuff that every single person agrees is bad, avoid it.
Yeah, yeah. Basically, he wants to create. Basically, he says that there are
You can
things.
even find that consensus on chattel slavery if you think about it.
Oh no, I mean, he'd probably argue that people who think that's a good thing are probably just not being consistent. They're probably not thinking of what if they were in that position or their family members or something like that. Maybe that's the sort of position he'd take. I'm speculating here, but from what I heard on his videos and from his interviews and his debates, he basically is always just going to appeal to objective moral facts in terms of what people just widely agree on and what they disagree on in terms of their flourishing. And that's just going to basically reduce down to some sort of utilitarianism. It's just going to be something about
That's not
pain and
even
pleasure.
utilitarianism. That's worse than utilitarianism. I'd say because they're saying like, let's go with what's popular.
Mm,
Like, okay, like fascism was popular in the 1930s.
right.
Well, that's the moral thing to go. Communism is popular. That yeah,
Well,
this
he's not
very
actually.
show.
Yeah, he's not actually. So he'll probably try to push back against the popularity thing. He'll just say, "No, that's how we just know or have broad knowledge that something is good or bad. Not that it constitutes what's good or bad, but." And that's actually another thing. How do we know what's good? That's called moral epistemology. And Sam is not really a moral philosopher. I'm not a moral philosopher either. I'm not published or anything, but he doesn't just strike me as convincing. At the end of the day, I think that there are problems with how he approaches knowledge of good and evil. He conflates objectivity with something that's just universally um, agreed upon, and then he tries to sneak, and then he might just try to sneak in pleasure and pain as being what signals the high and the low peaks. So, I mean, he's just trying to justify a sort of consequentialism. Like that's that's what struck me about how he came across with his moral theory. Although,
Well, yeah. So sorry.
although, oh, although, if anyone wants to say I've misunderstood Sam Harris, then feel free to write in the comments section. Maybe it'll benefit all of us, but I just at least from how he's communicated in various venues, I'm just not convinced of it, or at least the project he wants to go down. Plus, I think that there are a few other issues. So, for example, the virtuous life. So here's something that doesn't get taken into account when we look at pleasure and pain, or how he understands flourishing and non-flourishing. Let's assume, for example, that aliens invade the Earth and put human beings under mind control, and when we obey them, we feel like a bunch of pleasure, and we live longer, and by most human metrics of health, we're more disease free, and when we disobey them, we go in the exact opposite direction. It seems like we're not living a good life because we no longer have a sort of free will that's indicative of a free human being. It seems like we're just living in subservience to another being and their choices. So we no longer have an ability to do something or to do otherwise. And that strikes me as not a good life, despite the fact that
No,
it seems to
no.
be a very high point of human flourishing.
High point. That can be subjective.
That
Um,
is.
Question: have you ever read the book of or listened to a podcast or YouTube video about Andrew Clavin's conversion story?
Let's see. I believe a while ago, yeah, I believe one of the reasons why is it resorted to some sort of moral argument that if atheism
That
was
was
true, then some sort of anti-realism follows, and no one can really live a life where moral truths don't exist.
well. Yeah, yeah, that's a large part of it. I'll just retell it here.
Mm-hmm.
Like he comes from a huge atheist family,
Mm-hmm.
and like his dad's like a hardcore atheist. He's got like a library of his house of all the great atheist philosophers, and he would read them growing up. And he's like, none of these people make sense except for the Marquis de Sade, who just says,
Oh.
"Look, there's no God, so there's no right, no wrong. If it feels good, do it." Essentially, like that.
Mm-hmm.
And he's like, this is the only atheist philosopher that makes sense, you know? He's not trying to have it both ways, you know? He's just saying it like it is, you know?
Yeah. Yeah. So there is something to that. If atheism is true, isn't what follows going to be a sort of um, libertinism? So by a libertine is just somebody who seeks to maximize his own pleasure.
Mm.
Right. So a few interesting points though to be said about the Marquis de Sade. First off, he was a French aristocrat. Not everybody is in the position of a French aristocrat. So let's say morality doesn't exist. Let's say there is no God to enforce a set of morality, and instead, really somebody could if they just wanted to. Hello, hallelujah. All right. And if somebody just wanted to do that as a French aristocrat, yeah, they could get away. Why? Because if you're an aristocrat, there in France, then it's going to be very hard for someone to punish you, especially if you keep a lot of the debauchery a secret. But most of us are not French aristocrats. Most of us still are going to be held in contempt of other people who do have similar power than we do. And that's just going to end up devolving into a question of how do we broker power between individuals? And at the end of the day, we kind of have to resort to a prudential social system, something like a democracy where individuals can be held accountable towards one another through a system of checks and balances. So, uh, whatever the Marquis de Sade has to uh, whatever the Marquis de Sade wants to say about himself, maybe he does want to do all that, and maybe he is in a position to do all that. But at the very least, we can have like a prudential state of checks and balances, and this is where we get into what's called applied ethics. It's one thing to say that good and evil is dictated by your own will and preference, but it's another thing to be said that you can apply that. Most people could not apply that, or are not in a position to apply that. At
Yeah.
least, yeah. So I think that's why a lot of people don't see that as kind of like the logical consequence of atheism because we're not in his position. But I think that there are arguments to be had for God's existence from morality. So, for example, take the fact that we live in a universe where human beings can exercise moral agency. That is, we can be held blameworthy or praiseworthy for our actions. And think of the fact that a universe that on theism, beings like us are actually expected because we actually have one moral agent who already exists, namely God. God is a
Amen.
moral, yeah, God is a moral agent. He exists. He's a being that, um, like us, is an intellect. He is somebody who creates the universe, and he's somebody who diffuses his own goodness. So that's the reason why he creates for the sake of magnanimity, just as an exercise of his greatness. And this is an exercise he could have done or not have done. But if he is going to do that, then somebody has to receive his act of magnanimity. God is not going to just create a universe with no entity in it. So a universe like ours is actually more expected, where people can be blameworthy or praiseworthy for their action than one on naturalism. It doesn't mean this, and this is what's called like a probabilistic argument. So you could actually make probabilistic moral arguments for God's existence, and you can actually make these sorts of appeals that don't that are not as strong as saying no God, no morality, but they at the very least kind of bring up the weight of evidence. But I think that there are actually arguments that show moral realism or moral truths, if they exist, kind of push out a naturalistic explanation.
So, so I got a question. Is this like the stuff you're saying now? Is this the default of n- not just the mainline Catholic philosophers, but like Protestant too? Because
Mm-hmm.
we got some guys saying here you're going to be Anglican. So when
No,
you convert to Anglicanism, John, is your philosophy still going to be intact, or do they share what we share?
no, no, because Anglicanism is. I mean, that applies to people who still serve in pastoral roles who don't even believe in God. Who, um, so Anglicanism is that wide a net, and even still, but even so, if you look at philosophers of ethics or moral philosophers, not all of them actually agree with the moral argument. So, for example, Richard Swinburne is somebody who believes that even if atheism was true, there would still be moral truth. They're like brute facts of the universe. So it's not generally the default position. I'm trying to remember. Apparently, even Catholic philosophers might take this position as well. The philosopher Mark Murphy is a natural law philosopher. He takes this position, but that doesn't mean you can't have probabilistic arguments. Swinburne thinks that moral knowledge is actually more expected because God exists than naturalism. So how do we know? So it's one thing to say that moral facts exist, but how do we know them, even if they did? And if there's something you don't have interaction with in a causal sense, then it would only make then it's much more likely that God designed us to know these things than they would just exist in a way that's just inert. And no, and just to dispel any rumors, no, I'm not becoming an Anglican. I'd much rather just go back to Eastern Orthodoxy if Catholicism was shown to me to be um, not true. Or heck, I might even be a Lutheran before I'm an Anglican. I
Ooh, so you were convinced by Dr. Cooper's one argument against Anglicanism, then?
No, my argument against Anglicanism is that the 39 articles just don't really make sense from a traditional Catholic viewpoint. So if you read the 39
Yeah, except
article.
if you were thinking of converting, though, you probably wouldn't have that as your point of reference
Actually, no.
anymore.
If I was an Anglican, I need to agree with all 39 articles. I could not agree with the articles, for example, on the Eucharist. I think that Christ is really present in the Eucharist, and as much as Father James would disagree with us, I just can't read them and come away thinking that they allow for the Lutheran view of what is it, sacramental union or
Well,
anything like that. In fact, in England, when the 41 articles were published, that position was made illegal. So I don't think that such a position would have been covered under the 39 articles. Um, I
so
don't.
oh,
Uh,
sorry, yeah.
yeah, so that would be my first issue with it. The second issue I would have with the Anglican view is it's it's just really hard to believe in it and come away thinking that um, what is it? It's really hard to believe in the 39 articles and come away thinking that they wouldn't allow something akin to a purgatory. Um, I like at the very least the Orthodox have that.
Yeah, I think that
Oh, by the way, Francis Clark's book, I would highly recommend it. It's fantastic.
I've never read it, so I mean, I should write that down. Francis Clark with an E.
Yeah.
Francis. Clark book. But yeah, no, I thought Dr. Cooper had a great critique of Anglicanism, and he just had a single argument, saying that basically inside the body of Anglicanism, so much there's a huge range of belief on a huge range of topics, whereas you can't really do that. Now I know Father, like I thought that was a good argument, and then I know Father James did a response, but it was like an hour and 40 minutes. I'm like, I
I
don't have
mean,
enough.
that's a really weird argument coming from a Lutheran. I mean, how many Lutherans disagree amongst themselves too? I
Well,
mean, the Lutheran Church Missouri Synod is very different from the Lutheran Evangelical Church.
he was talking about like, well, I suppose like, yeah, that's true. Like now everything's up for grabs, but I think if you go back to like the year 1600, if you were a Lutheran, it was more monolithic than the Anglicans were. So to be a traditional Lutheran, there's a pretty strict definition versus a traditional Anglican. There's a range of things. But again, I should probably have Father James on to discuss this, um, since he would certainly know better than you or me. Okay, but we're getting off topic. All right.
Right. Moral.
So I'm curious. Would someone like Father James, have you talked with Father James on this? Uh,
I haven't talked to him about morality, but I find a lot of people tend to have, like, a lot of Christians tend not to be familiar with moral philosophy.
that's
And this is even myself too. Like, take the most common sort of argument against God's involvement in ethics, like the Euthyphro dilemma. Most people don't really know how to respond to it. So this argument is something good because God commands it, or does God command it because it's good? Most people say, goodness is the nature of God. And now that sounds like a very nice response, and Trent Horn makes this too. So think of it like this: the meter is the meter. The meter. How do we know something is a meter? Well, it's because it corresponds to a meter ruler. How do we know those rulers are a meter? Well, they correspond to the meter stick over in Paris. Well, those things are just meters because we seem to just agree. Like, we could have designated a lot of measurements a meter. And that's not really, and so that's not really a good kind of a comparison. And to say that God is the good, that also strikes me as being, well, it's not something you can just really declare, because when we say is, like, is that is of identity? So are they two things which are identical to each other, like H2O and water, or kinetic energy and heat, that they're an identity we have to discover? In which case, you're going to need some evidence. Like, what is the evidence that these two things are identical to each other? And how do we also reconcile the fact that goodness seems to be normative? Like, it basically pushes you that you ought to do something, whereas, God's nature seems to be more descriptive. You're describing sets of properties. So, and why is it that these particular properties, like being loving, kind, merciful, just, like, why are those the good properties and not the exact opposite? So, like, that kind of, I'm not saying these are unresolvable, but that kind of introduces a huge can of worms. And you also have to commit yourself to an idea that that certain identity relations are a posteriori. So Superman, and so, for example, think of Superman and Clark Kent. Like, those are just two names for the same entity. But it seems like when we're speaking of God and the good, that those are a little more than names. So how exactly are those two things related? So a lot of these questions are going to come up when it comes to divine command theory, and that's just not going to be the solution you necessarily want to adopt. It's not even the solution I like to adopt. My position is, I take the position that God commands something because it is good for us. So, and I think that human nature is actually what dictates what is good for us, not God's command. So I think the reason the Euthyphro dilemma fails is not because there's some middle term, but because God decides to create a certain entity with certain functions, and these functions are just and some things are going to be good for that entity because they lead to a harmony of the whole. So, for example, let's say I create a car, and because I create a car, I realize it needs oil to be changed repeatedly. So, oil is good for the car. And if I could design a car that didn't require oil changes, I probably would. But because of the fact that I want it to be made of certain parts and in certain relations, I have to acquiesce and say, no, no, this is what's good for the oil. And I'm going to tell people that they need to change the oil every so often and at certain parts. However, if God is creating a human being and he wants, by human being, God wants to create a rational social animal, then what's good for a rational social animal isn't determined by God by fiat, but rather it's determined by the nature of a social rational animal. And
So
that,
that's the difference between you and, say, divine command theory. Am I
yeah,
following that?
yeah, that
Okay.
would be the difference between someone like me who takes this position and probably someone who just learns morality from most introductions to moral apologetics. So we would ground it in the nature of a person, and this is actually something that's very common in terms of Catholic moral philosophy. So, for example, God could not command that homosexuality is a good thing, and or permit it. And why is that? Because it's just not something that's good for rational social animals. And the reason for this is going to fall back to an assessment of our nature. So, for example, because human beings are social animals, our reproductive ends are going to be for creating more social beings. As rational animals, unlike brute animals, so unlike monkeys or other animals who don't cognize their sexual
John,
relations
don't you
and
know we used to be monkeys? Oh, get with the times.
even if evolution is true, we're especially even if evolution is true, that's only going to explain at most our material or bodily origins. It doesn't explain the fact that we've been endowed with a soul that gives us the power of reason and free will, and that can hold us accountable. Human beings actually formulate their moral systems. We can reflect on it, debate it with one another, and this is what separates us from the brutes.
And on top of all that, evolution isn't true. So,
I'm just granting it for the sake of
yeah, yeah,
argument,
yeah, yeah, yeah.
right? But so even granting it for the sake of argument, that doesn't work. So because we're social animals and because we're rational animals, we know that our sexual interactions are going to be geared towards the common good of society, that is reproduction, and rules that contravene this end or purpose that make it primarily about human pleasure, those rules are going to destabilize or undercut that primary purpose. And that leads to negative consequences. So, for example, sex, think sex that's purely thought of for the end of pleasure is going to destabilize society. So,
Yeah.
yeah, so this is why in Canada and the United States, like what is the rate of replacement? It's going to be like for every couple has 2.3 kids. Like that's not enough to grow the population and take care of the past population. This is why we send for far more immigrants. And of course, because we take the best immigrants from other countries, you're taking away a valuable social commodity from another society in order to replace human beings, or your fellow social members. So that leads to a destabilization of the common good, and actually, I think quite a bit of it was predicted in Humanae Vitae on contraception, which is, which has the same issues with homosexuality. It contravenes the final end of reproduction and replaces it with pleasure, and that destabilizes the whole purpose or end of having marriages. This is actually why even infertile couples who can't reproduce, they're allowed. It's not immoral for them to be wedded and to engage in sexual action because, at the very least, the way that they do it, it's still reinforcing the sort of norm and idea that we kind of want. It's this. It doesn't mean that every individual couple needs to reproduce. It just means that the sort of couples that we permit and normalize are going to be ones that are good for that common end and reinforce reproduction. Um, so, uh, so think of it. Another way to think of it is like this. Alan, would you say it's true or false that cats have four legs?
Unless they've been mutilated for some reason, true.
Yeah, that's true of the whole species. All you could actually say all cats have four legs. Now, if you have a cat that doesn't have four legs, let's say it has three legs because, as you said, it's been mutilated. When we speak of it, all cats having four legs, we mean that's how they ought to be. They ought to be four-legged. Just like when we say all heterosexual couples are engaged in a reproductive form of sex, we don't mean that they always reproduce. What we mean is that is how the result ought to be. That's the expected norm. And this is why we can still include certain exceptions. But homosexual relationships or relationships that are primarily there out of for pleasure, that make full use of contraception, those are there to contravene that end. So this is why we don't permit them. And fertile couples tend to not choose their infertility. They tend to just have it, unfortunately, out of happenstance. So
Yeah.
they're not undercutting the norm. So this is kind of why God commands in light of human nature. It's because God knows his design. He knows what kind of beings he created. He knows what's good for those beings, even if we don't understand his rules ourselves. We can always look to human nature as sort of a basis for understanding his certain commandments. And this would kind of be my general approach to ethics. It's one that's in tandem with natural law theory. So natural law theory is just the view that you can just look to nature to see good and evil, and it's just an assessment of God's creation. Heck, there are even atheistic versions of natural law theory. I don't think they work, but they're there as well. No.
That's
Sam
not
Harris
really
is
natural law, but
no. I think he's just a naive consequentialist.
he's doing the best that he can. He's basically has utilitarianism, but he's trying to like couch it in something more sophisticated. In fact, it's probably even worse than utilitarianism, as I pointed out before. But okay. So question. Right now, on June 5th, 2022, as this is being filmed, who is the world's greatest moral philosopher in your opinion, alive today?
Hmm. Let's see. The greatest one. So here, I'm just going to suggest. I'm just going to quickly get his book out. Unfortunately, unlike you, Alan, I get a lot of my purchases from Kindle, so that means I don't have the hard copy on the ready, just in case of this. So just bear with me for a minute.
See, I can't do that. I would fry my eyes.
Fair enough. So there's a moral philosopher by the name of David E. Alexander. Oh, so
It's just a big blur when you put it in the.
maybe it clears. Sorry, I'm just trying to get it to the title page because you can. All right, no, I can't get it. So David E. Alexander, he's a Calvinist, but he does a great job of getting into moral philosophy, and he does, and he has and this book basically covers moral semantics. What does good mean? What does it mean to say you ought to do something and what you ought not to do something? He defends the metaphysics behind evil as a privation of the good. He's just very phenomenal, and I would highly suggest him. He's my favorite to read so far. Uh, uh, David Oderberg is another fantastic ethicist as well. He basically he's a Thomist himself. He did a lot to defend the pro-life position in abortion by use of natural law. I would suggest him. Edward Phaser is a pretty good. He's not a moral theorist, but he's a very good popularizer, and he should give you a nice introduction. So I'd suggest Phaser as well.
What about a guy named David P. Gucci?
David P. Gush. I'm not sure I've heard of him.
Yeah, he's a moral philosopher, but he's a crazy liberal. He endorses Matthew Vine's project to make the church accept sodomy. So, yeah, he's part of Matthew Vine's crew. David
Apparently,
Gucci.
he's a professor.
Yeah, I believe so.
Man,
He's
then you can
spoken
find a
at
PhD.
Matthew Vine. Sorry.
You could find a PhD to defend anything.
Yeah, that's what's so interesting about people with PhDs. I know a girl has a PhD in sociology, and I'll tell you after the stream. She defends some interesting positions. We always have friendly arguments.
Interesting. So, right. So I'm not. So I haven't read any of his work. But a lot of the time, if you're an ethicist, you usually try to specialize in a particular field. So, like Phaser actually writes a lot about the perverted faculty argument against contraception, homosexuality, abortion, that sort of thing,
And the
and
death
and the death
penalty,
penalty.
right?
Yeah,
Yeah,
yeah. The
because
death penalty. Yeah, the death penalty is an interesting one. So you could so yeah, I'm not sure how. So on natural law theory, I think you can definitely defend the death penalty, but you can actually still come up with prudential reasons for why the death penalty might not be best enacted in specific situations. So, for example,
oh
it
yeah,
might be
no one who believes in the death penalty says it should be used for absolutely every
yeah.
crime.
Oh
Yeah.
no, but not even that. So, for example, let's say that by enacting the death penalty in a specific case, it would lead to a huge race riot. I think a prudential civic leader would be like, okay, fine. We're just going to pardon this guy because the evil that results
Or
from
keep him in prison for life.
yeah, just exactly like that's not yeah that would be a much better scenario given what could follow from executing in that particular case. Even though the minister has the right to put him to death, he might have some reason overriding reasons not to in a particular case.
Oh, is this the what's it called again? The principle of double effect?
Yes, actually,
Ooh,
yeah.
I bet. Yeah.
Yeah, that's a yeah. Actually, this would count as one. So the principle of double effect is basically going to say that if that a certain action can bring about two effects, and it's okay to permit a certain action to come about which has an evil effect, so long as there is a good effect that comes with it, and that good effect is going to be of greater is going to be of a greater benefit than the evil that would result of it. So Philippa Foot uses the example of, although she uses it as a kind of way to undercut it. So imagine if
Well, it does sound. I can already anticipate what the potential counter argument is, that there's a lot of subjectivity involved.
no, that's not her.
Oh,
So
really?
no,
Oh.
no, her argument is basically there's really no difference between the principle of double effect and using evil as a means of bringing about some good. So
Yeah, I've thought that myself. What's the counter to that?
yeah, so the counter to that is you're not responsible for the evil, whereas in double effect in the principle of double effect you aren't responsible for the correlating evil, but when you use evil as a means you are responsible for it. So permitting
Oh,
evil
that's
and
clever,
bring
actually.
yeah, so permitting evil and bringing it about are two different things. So here's an example. Let's say and again, this was kind of used as a way of attacking the difference. So let's say that you have an uncle, and this uncle knows he's going to he's going to inherit money from his brother, that is your dad, if he kills you. So When you're sleeping, he gets a pillow and starts snuffing you, and he kills you, and you die. Now he's responsible for murder, and he caused your death. But let's say that the scenario is a little different. Let's say that in your sleep you turn over, and you're and he starts suffocating on the pillow because you're just in a very awkward position where you can't breathe. Um, and he knows that you're going to suffocate to death unless he flips you. And he decides not to, and he just allows you to die. So it seems like in these two cases that the same effect was brought about, even though one is due to permission and the other is due to him actually acting out on it. But the response there is there seems to be a difference between reckless endangerment of another person, which doesn't warrant something heinous like the death penalty in proportion to the crime, versus him actually going about and doing it, like really planning it out. So, so it seems like in terms of the consequences that we want to follow as a punishment for an action, they're going to be different. And I think we're going to want to circle back to the distinction between allowing something and causing something as the main explanation. So the example of double effect is there's a difference between throwing a switch and allowing one other individual to die as a result of it, and he's already on the track due to somebody else. So you're just permitting an evil that where somebody else just put him in danger, versus you pushing somebody in front of a train track. So that's arguably going to be a distinction. But anyway, so that would be a result of the principle of double effect. And even in terms of prudence, for example, Pope Francis, when he argues against the death penalty, he'll actually make some prudential points too. Like, there are countries where people who are put to death are most likely going to be minorities, so people who are black.
Yeah, but I mean, if a black person commits a crime,
mhm.
I mean, it's
Yeah.
not like, well, he's black, he's off the hook, you know?
So some of these, yeah, I mean that's true. So it could be the case that because more black people are put in front of the judge and jury for the crime, that might explain it. But if you do things like if you factor in the amount of people who are going to appear, the heinousness, the level of evidence, like just make sure all things are as equal as possible when you're doing the measurement. It might be the case that people just have an innate bias or towards people who are minorities in a society. Um, and it might not even be anyone's fault. It might not even be something that people are cognizant of. So, like, these are sorts of prudential reasons we might consider for why we might not permit the death penalty. But yeah.
Did you hear Trent Horn's debate with Tim Gordon on the
Yeah,
death penalty?
I did. I thought Tim Gordon came out on top of that one, but
Oh yeah. Oh,
yeah,
did
but
he?
I probably would have addressed Tim's point a different way than Trent would have.
Why?
Oh, so I think the death penalty. So I think that the death penalty is something that um, violates the commandment "Thou shalt not kill," and the reason why in Scripture the death penalty is enacted, and why St. Paul even permits it, is because God gives a dispensation to ministers of the state to do so. So if that's the case, then it's only by God's grace that that ministers could in fact do it. But if that power is just something which is given to them by God, and the church has the power to bind and loose what God has given the ministers of the state, Pope Francis wants to say, no, you shouldn't do the death penalty. It's inadmissible now. He can bind it as well as he can loose it.
Well, did he bind it with a capital B? I mean, he's certainly against it, but
Yeah,
did he bind it with the capital B? The
yeah,
big
that's actually a good question. So did he? So this is where it would be a very so this is why it's a very unprecedented thing because
one.
no, yeah. So is what Pope Francis said enough to bind it? Well, he seems to be teaching. He seems to have taught it from a place from the chair.
Yeah,
He
he's
seems it seems like if he's changing the catechism such that he's teaching Catholics that they ought not to do this, that given circumstance it's bound, then I think he could do it. Again, I take a very Scotistic position. I think, like Scotus, it's an act of God's voluntary will. It's not a matter of natural law. I
Hmm.
think so. I think that so. I have a very different take than most Catholics, but again, this Pope Francis's dictate is so new. I think pretty much every Catholic moral philosopher is kind of in a tizzy to explain it and explain past rulings. This is my best explanation. If somebody else wants to just say that he did it, but it's not binding or it's not as binding as prior teaching, then I don't think I'm in a position to argue with it. But this is my way of just answering the data.
Okay, so question then. Um, I think, and I'm going to throw something out here. I think he contradicted John Paul II on this because John Paul II kind of sets the precedent. Like this is how everyone thinks it is. JP2 sets the precedent. Francis takes it to its logical conclusion. However, Francis' argument actually contradicts John Paul II because John Paul II, I'm going off memory, but I think his argument was there's no point killing them when we can lock them away for life. But Francis condemned life in prison too as a secret death or a covert death penalty. I can't remember
Yeah.
the word used. So I mean, technically, he's
Mm-hmm.
contradicting the foundation the supposed foundation he's pretending to stand on.
Well, actually, this it's funny that you mentioned because in the Catechism, when they quote Francis, actually he makes the same appeal that John Paul II did. And if you're going to explain why, and if we're going to explain his dislike of life imprisonments and make that consistent, I don't think it is myself. But to be fair, it doesn't have any binding power. It's not ordinary magisterium. It's not extraordinary magisterium. He doesn't teach it out of the catechism. He doesn't teach it through anything that has like a very
I think it's in I believe it's Fratelli Tutti. I think I
no.
could
You're
be
right.
wrong. It's been a
You're right.
while
It is
since.
for Tutti, but I think that I think that this is just one of those cases where Pope Francis is just an error.
I agree. We
Yeah,
agree. Yeah.
we'll agree on that much. But and I think he's contradicting himself. Like, but
Oh yeah.
yeah, but we don't go by just anything that the Pope says in any document. We do have to assess how it stands in regards to the ordinary magisterium, what's always just been taught and everywhere and every time through these papal documents, and it doesn't seem like he's binding us to anything. So he doesn't say that life in prison is inadmissible in that document. He just basically tries to equate them. And
Well, he says it's a covert death penalty, and just before that, he had condemned the death penalty.
right, so he
So
tries right. So I
he's
don't.
trying to have it both ways.
He
He's
is.
trying
I'm
to have
saying
his cake and eat it too.
yeah. What I'm saying is he's wrong about. What I'm saying is he's wrong about that. Like and I don't think that it binds us to it because I don't think he's saying that he's bound us to believe that the death penalty, that life in prison is a covert death penalty.
All right. All right. Questions. All right. Let's get the questions for John here. John will answer it. He's an expert in this stuff.
I'm
And
not an expert. I'm just a guy with a hobby.
guy with a hobby. Okay. You know, but you know, I wouldn't call myself an expert on the Crusades. You know, just a hobby of mine. But I could still give you the answer, just like you're going to give the answer to a bunch of these inquirers. All right, guys, throw the questions John's way. All right. In the meantime, while we're waiting for questions, you can talk about any projects you have on the go, what's coming up on Original Win.
Well, I'm not planning on anything in the near future, but I've decided to take some time to work on my personal life. I've started a relationship with a girl I really love from Peru. We've I just
Oh,
went to visit her last month. We saw Argentina together, and yeah, I'm just working on getting the resources necessary to start a family. Remember, guys. The church is spread not by arguing on the internet, well, not just arguing on the internet, it's also by having families and putting what we learn into application.
That's true.
So I'm just focusing on that portion of my life right now, and I might be back in the near future if I have some downtime. I might post a video if I think it's interesting, or if I just want to give my own 2 cents on a subject. But yeah, that's what I've got going on.
Okay, so no media plans for any
Uh,
content or anything.
And I'm starting a
I've
new
got a
job.
question.
I'm actually starting a new job tomorrow, so I'm going to be focused on that one.
Oh, well, best of luck with your job. Everyone say a prayer for John tonight. Question. You go to Argentina. Like, how's the faith there? Is it good? Is it bad? Is it so compared to the other Catholic countries you've been to? Like, do you spend time in Peru as well?
I did. I spent time in both Argentina and Peru.
Okay, so how's the church in those two countries? I'm just
Well, actually, so the church in Peru is actually pretty good. It's what you'd expect in. It's actually what I expect in Canada. It has a pretty, how should I put it? It has a very charismatic bent to it, but the priest there is really nice, and the parishioners there were lovely. The Novus Ordo there, it's kind of nice having one that doesn't require projectors or guitars. I'm not too huge a fan of those, but
mm,
it's quite nice. Once and the nice thing about the Novus Ordo is that I was able to follow along and provide the right prayers in every place, even though I didn't speak Spanish. So I could just
mm.
follow along in English and say the and commit everything I learned in English to heart. And that's actually one of the great things about having a very structured liturgy. Uh, so I knew which Eucharistic prayer they were using. For example, it's usually two. Um, Chances are, if they want to keep it short, it's going to be number two. Uh, and I would say that the faith there, like the people who practice it, are the congregation doesn't consist of like the whole city or town, um, but but they have very nice and humble communities. I celebrated it in downtown Peru as well. That is Easter and the liturgy, and it was pretty packed there. So a lot of Catholics there can also be Christmas, Easter. A lot of it isn't too different from what I see in Canada. As for Argentina, the churches there pretty are also pretty packed on Sundays as well. I actually went to a Maronite church there that I really loved attending. So
Nice.
so I'd say that I was pretty content being a Catholic there. But it's actually very funny. When I was going to confession, the priest there was a lot more lenient than when I was in Canada, because I confessed the same sin to both, and the priest in Canada was actually much more sterner with me about it.
Oh, interesting. Do you go to a Maronite church on a regular basis, if you don't mind sharing?
I used to do it a lot more, but now but because I like to sleep in the morning, I go to Novus Ordo Mass, and
My
it's
mass is at 7:15 a.m.
oh, oh, brother, you're much stronger than I am. I go to a Novus Ordo Mass. Um, the congregation there is actually pretty young. They have a good range of folks, everywhere from like young kids to people in their 50s and 60s. And it's a really growing and vibrant community. So I would say it's great there. And believe it, and I'll get into a little more detail maybe after the production why I'm going more into like the Novus Ordo
Okay.
Mass as opposed to the
Okay.
Maronite one. But yeah.
Okay. Yeah. It looks like we got no questions. Um. Uh. Yeah. So I suppose we'll kill the stream on the hour. You got 1 minute. Finish us off here, John.
All right. If anyone's interested in a good introduction to ethics, I would say that probably your best bet is any textbook you could find in an introduction to philosophy class. Like I'm pretty sure you can find one on the internet. There's a fantastic anthology on ethics though that I would strongly recommend. Let me just find it here quickly in my library. Oh, Ethical Theory and Anthology by and it oh, yeah let's see Ethical Theory and Anthology, and it's
Who's the
edited,
author?
and
Oh,
it's an anthology, so it's a lot of authors, but it's edited by Russ Schaefer Landau, and it's by
Lando.
Landau, Landau,
Oh, boo. That's not the Lando I like.
not Lando Calrissian,
Yeah.
and it's by Wiley Blackwell, and it's basically a compilation of all these very important moral philosophy papers.
Is it expensive? Is it like an academic publish
It is
job?
it is very expensive, but the Kindle one is fairly affordable. I'd suggest that.
Okay. I can't do that. I would fry my eyes out. We've got Jade thinking, digesting the intro. No questions yet. All right. Well, if you do need a question, you can always go. John is John Fisher on Twitter. John Fisher 2.0.
Oh, actually, I privatized my Twitter account. I'm not going to be using it for the near future.
Mm,
It's too distracting. I'm trying to limit all my online arguments to zero, but if I'm just trying to exercise that self control. If you don't have self control and you have no control, you should just step away, and that's basically what I'm doing for the meantime. But if anyone has any questions, not just about ethics, but anything related to Catholic theology, questions in general, I'd also be happy to answer those. The
yeah,
Trinity, if
and
you like.
yeah. Like if you don't have any questions right this second, you can always put them in the comments, and uh, I, I, I suppose John will check back in a few days if there's anything there. He'll answer it. Yeah, no, this was good. This is something I know zero about. I know zero about. So I'm glad you suggested this. Guys, tune in on Wednesday. I'm going to be having William Albrecht on. We're going to go over the Apocrypha.
You
Um,
mean the Apocrypha, or the Deuterocanon?
the Deuterocanon.
Okay, because when I hear Apocrypha, I just hear books that don't belong in the Bible.
Yeah, like Enoch and stuff.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, but like what's like the people I'm trying to reach call it the Apocrypha, like our 7 books that we have. Uh so yeah, so like a Protestant will see that and they'll be like, "Ooh, wow, let's go." And then they'll want to
Uh,
convert after because William's that good. All right, guys, I'm going to kill the stream. John, thank you for coming on, and thanks for everyone for watching. Like and subscribe my channel, Alan Rule, and Original Wind Productions. I will see you all on Wednesday, and God bless.
God bless.